My Govanen, and welcome to the Palantir Podcast, the broadcasting arm of GHG Palantir, a completely online Tolkien discussion group. We are an offshoot of the Grey Havens group. You can find out more about us at the Grey Havens Reading Group on Facebook or at greyhavensgroup.org. So to carry on from our previous meeting, we are still in the midst of the Valaquenta. We have not yet even reached the Quenta Silmarillion proper. And we're going to discuss a little bit about the nature of Tolkien's creation as seen in the Valaquenta. As is stated in the preface by Christopher Tolkien, the various chapters that we see within the published Silmarillion represent different times in his father's life and different conceptions of the creation and the nature of Middle-earth itself. We get a sense of the creation story in the Valaquenta, which is slightly different from that we see in the Ainulindalë. There's a passage in the very beginning of this chapter, just before the portion on the Valar, which reads, "Long they labored in the regions of Ea, which are vast, beyond the thought of elves and men, until in the time appointed was made Arda, the kingdom of earth. Then they put on the raiment of earth and descended into it, and dwelt therein." One of the things we like to do at our group meetings is really dissect passages like this, which are seemingly simple and yet hold vast secret depths if you look at the language that's being used. The impression given by the Ainulindalë is that following the music, Iluvatar creates the vision and then creates a manifestation of the vision with the word Ea, let it be. And at that moment, too, that Arda itself is created as a sort of mass of material that has not realized its final form, that then the Valar enter into and begin their labors. It's a little bit different in the Valaquenta. What we hear is the same pronouncement of Ea, but Ea is actually a space. You could think of it as the galaxy or the universe. And within that space, the Valar work and ultimately create within the galaxy Arda. And then from there enter into Arda to begin their labor in the formation of the world. One of the things that's really intriguing about looking at the Valaquenta as well as the Ainulindalë is how this potentially represents Tolkien's ideas about creation, whether it be in a metaphorical sense or simply a creative and imaginative sense. And there are many parallels that can be seen with the biblical narrative. In particular, one of the things that comes up constantly within Tolkien's writing is numbers and the importance of numbers. And in particular in the Silmarillion, the numbers 3 and 7, and numbers that are divisible by those two numbers, appear constantly. And so when we see this description in the Valaquenta, we are kind of seeing a representation of the 7, or the 6 rather, days of creation in the Bible narrative. And when we talk about the Valar entering into Ea, and Ea was before, well, in the biblical narrative in Genesis, we have the void that was before, which is then separated into the darkness and the light, and then further separated between the firmament, which is the heavens, and the waters. And then the waters are further separated between the waters and dry land. We have a similar sequence of divisions in half throughout the course of the creation of Arda. So too, you can look at this too in the sense of numbers. There are 6 days within the creation of the world in the biblical narrative. There are 3 themes in the music of the Ainur. Now, one of the really interesting pieces of applicability is the idea of St. Augustine, who says that to sing is to pray twice. Well, we have 3 themes, and those themes are sung by the Valar. Therefore, we can think of it as praying twice, and therefore having 6 themes or 6 prayers of creation. And therefore, we can see how there's this sort of similar sequence of events whereby the 6th day of creation, in which Adam is created, aligns with the 3rd theme, in which the children of Iluvatar are created. And so there's this interesting parallel which pops up over and over again. You have the same 2 also appear in this chapter, with the nature of the Valar, separated between the male and female, 7 and 7. In the biblical narrative, which I believe we looked it up during the meeting, I think it was in Job. You can correct me if I'm wrong in comments. There's a comment with regards to the archangels and there being 7. There's 7 and 7 in the narrative in the Valaquenta. Now, whether any of this is actually the derivation that Tolkien had or not is immaterial. But what it does do is help us to understand sort of the building blocks that Tolkien's using. Because when we look back at our own primary world history, music in particular, arithmetic, and numbers were critical. If we look back at Greek, Roman, and then Renaissance times, where science in particular and knowledge in mathematics were important to an understanding of the world, music in particular and the harmonics of music were understood to be the building blocks of the cosmos, and that to understand music and to understand the mathematics of music was to understand the nature of creation. And therefore, when we create, or when Tolkien creates his music in the music of the Ainur, and his story, and reinserts the music, reinserts the idea of the importance of numbers and of proportion and harmonies, we see a reassertion of the nature of the cosmos, which has been an understanding of the universe that has been common throughout humanity for thousands of years. And we see in this then another strata of this idea of subcreation. Tolkien believed in the idea that we are made, in the Judeo-Christian sense, we are made in the image and likeness of a creator God. And being in his likeness, we create because he creates. We create because our creator was a creator, and we are drawn to do that which we were made in the image of. And that underlies and is foundational to much of the conception of the creation of Arda as well. In the last meeting on the Valaquenta, we talked about the idea of a reverse Tower of Babel. That in the beginning, many of the Valar do not understand each other at all. They do not talk, they do not cooperate, and it's working towards a final music at the end of time in which everyone will understand and everyone will be in harmony. And it's those moments of harmony in which the world works. As so often happens with the Grey Havens group Palantir meetings, this led far afield into tangential arguments on the nature of knowledge. and the benefits and the downfalls of specialization versus broad knowledge. And in particular, we were looking at the difference between humanity of today and the knowledge we have and the ties we have with technology, and how that changes our thought patterns and our knowledge patterns, versus 400 years ago, where you had the great masters who were called uomo universale, universal men. People like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Galileo, who knew intimately the workings of music, mathematics, war, engineering, art, sculpture, building. And granted, you can argue that the depth of the knowledge wasn't perhaps as much as we have today. And yet the breadth of that knowledge was astounding, where each person in and of themselves could essentially embody a university, a universal man, a universal thought, a universal knowledge. Whereas today, granted, we have that universal knowledge at our fingertips through technology, but we also don't have the framework they did to understand that universal knowledge or to be able to figure it out on our own. We are tied to that technology. And so we began to look at this in the sense of the Valar and how they work. And we noted last time that there seems to be a pairing between Valar, husband and wife, and very few of them are singular. And that it seems that in general, they're more powerful when they work together. And when we see Melkor in particular often doing his own thing and trying to control things, whether it be the seas, the airs, the creation itself, through his own power and through the negation of others, it doesn't work. He fails. It's kind of that difference between specialization and broader knowledge, a knowledge of more rather than less, even though that less is that much further progressed. And we can think of this in a sense as a commentary in Tolkien's mind, potentially, on where the world has gone in terms of mechanization and industrialization. We know, based on his letters and his own causes that he was party to during his life, that the mechanization and the industrialization of England was something that severely pained him. And so we can understand then why the order with a capital O that Sauron, Melkor, and Saruman are after is problematic. Because that order is the negation of doubt, the negation of others, the negation of effort of a natural form, because nature does not necessarily move linearly. It doesn't necessarily move in a predictable way because it is the combination of multiple parts. It's essentially a gestalt. It's a greater sum than its parts. Whereas the efforts of Melkor are to control singularly and to dominate and to have it bend to his will and thereby become not living but dead. In particular, we were looking at this idea in further reference to biblical passages and looking at the story of Cain and Abel, which at first would seem to imply a duality between Manwë and Melkor, being that Ilúvatar, in his thought, envisioned the two as brothers. And yet, if you recall, we discussed that Melkor and Aule in many ways are the same. They have the same capabilities, the same powers, the same interests. But the primary difference between the two is very much the primary difference between Cain and Abel. Because the downfall of Cain, even before the murder, was the fact that he did not want to sacrifice his own work. He did not give the better part of his efforts in sacrifice, whereas Abel did. Aule creates for the pleasure of creating, and the things he creates, he does for the benefit of all. Whereas Melkor creates for the purpose of further domination and creates with the idea in mind that it will further his own power. Now, we can also see in Aule potential for seeing Cain in the creation of the dwarves. However, this action on Aule's part was innocent. It was not in the idea of self-interest or domination, but in the interest of affection and love and wanting to share knowledge. And it is for that reason that he is forgiven by Iluvatar, and the dwarves are adopted as children of Iluvatar. Now, this is a question on the nature of the dwarves that we're going to return to over and over and over again, but it kind of brought into mind this idea of where do the dwarves actually fit in relation to the music? When we look at the music, and in particular in the chapter The Ainulindale, there's a couple of notations that state boldly that Iluvatar is able to enter into the music and change things, that he can do things that are not explicitly in the music, and that he holds some things secret to himself. The dwarves, in a sense, are of this nature, because if they had truly been part of the music, how did Aule truly transgress? And would they really have needed to be adopted by Iluvatar in the first place? Is this a moment where we see Iluvatar enter in? Because the dwarves are very much different from the eagles or the ents, who Manwë himself states later were in the music from the beginning. We don't necessarily know about the dwarves, and therefore, do they have a status similar to men, as stated in the earlier drafts of the Silmarillion in the Book of Lost Tales, where they have an ability to transcend or to move against or to be free of the music, because in some sense the dwarves aren't part of the music? We don't know. But as you can tell, this is one of our usual digressions, which lead far afield and tend to go fairly deep. But it led even further than that, because we got into discussion on the nature of Nienna, which we discussed last time, and her importance to the story, particularly her importance to the formation of the character of Olorin, who we all know and love as Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Nienna is known as being the Valar of sorrow and sadness, of pity, endurance, and hope, all of which are embodied in Olorin and the powers that he puts forth. But the recurring question which has come up through many of our meetings from one of our members is, why do the hobbits play such a critical role in the activity of the Third Age, in the downfall of Sauron? Well, where do the hobbits actually come from? We don't really know, It's supposed that they are from the race of men. We questioned whether they could perhaps be related even to dwarves, or maybe even petty dwarves. Um, but the problem there is they are noted to be quite antisocial, which is about as far from a hobbit as you can get. However, when we look at a hobbit and we look at their nature, hobbits don't necessarily go out for adventure. They tend to live off the land, and they tend to pretty much go with the flow as long as they get their food and have enjoyable company, and sometimes not even that, but as long as they're well fed and entertained, they live a fairly bucolic life. And anyone who lives that kind of life, a more rural life, is used to a fairly slow and patient and enduring pattern of life, which is exactly the sort of life pattern we see in the Shire. The hobbits, in a sense, live out the life that Nienna would endorse, a life of endurance, a life that is built around patience, a life that is conducive to pity and mercy and understanding of others. In a sense, in large part due to their innocence and the fact that they often keep themselves outside of the larger chaos of the world. In the Ainulindale, we saw that the third theme, its dominant force, is sadness. A sad, low theme that ripples underneath everything, and yet is able to pierce through the cacophony of Melkor's music and often harmonize with it. So we question, are the hobbits then a vehicle for Nienna's power in Middle-earth? And are they chosen by Gandalf to be the actors in the final definitive movements of the Third Age because they are suited to that work? And that's why Gandalf comes to Bilbo and ultimately to Frodo, that they are suited to the work of Nienna, that they are, in a sense, disciples of Nienna. That's one way to look at it. The other is to look at the hobbits, and in particular to look at them in relation to dwarves and wonder, did they appear essentially out of nowhere as maybe an offshoot of men, but essentially as an insertion of the will of Iluvatar, therefore placing them outside of the music entirely, and therefore able to transcend the music and move outside of the music, and therefore defeat the movement of Melkor, because they are able to sing the descant. We don't know. But it is an interesting way to look at this whole thing, and it does give perhaps one of the better explanations for why hobbits. All of this grew, of course, out of that initial passage and looking at the biblical nature of this story, as well as looking at the character of Olorin himself, who is one of the more recognizable characters, or at least one of the first truly recognizable characters that we see to come out of the Silmarillion so far. The other that we see, of course, is Melian, who will, of course, become much more important later. But then we also see Ossé and Uinen. And again, we have a pairing between the two. And there's a passage in here which is interesting and is often overlooked. And when you read Tolkien, he often throws in these very brief, very pointed sentences, but they give you a lot of information, a lot of narrative meat on these bones. In the introduction of Ausse, we have the introduction of the idea that Ausse rebelled. And the text tells us Melkor hated the sea, for he could not subdue it. What does that tell you? If he could not subdue it, past tense, means that Melkor attempted to subdue the sea. We know based on the Ainulindale that Melkor's primary powers are extreme heat and cold, or at least his unique powers as opposed to most of the other Ainur. And that he already has had dealings with the seas and with water, which has created steams and rain and ice and snow. But he's jealous of that power. He's jealous of the sea, which we also saw earlier in the Valaquenta allow Ulmo to essentially be present throughout the entirety of Arda, through all the streams, the pools, the fountains, the oceans, the rivers, and so on and so forth. He has a presence. Melkor wants that power. Melkor wants that ability to be everywhere, to know everything, to see everything. He wants dominance. And so he looks at the sea, and he attempts to dominate it. Now, I could easily envision him trying to do something, either with extreme heat or cold, and creating a vast hurricane or something similar. And Ausse being drawn to that raw power because this is the sort of force that Ausse can control. And therefore, that would lead to a certain natural alliance between Melkor and Ausse, which would make sense. However, you need to be aware that storms aren't necessarily a bad thing. Storms are natural and often are good. If we look at through history and what we would deem natural disasters today would actually be something people would pray for and look forward to, like the flooding of the Nile for fertility, or the blast of a volcano, again, creates fertile land. Or again, with forest fires or brush fires. All of these things tend to happen to a certain degree in a cyclical manner and usually have some part in creating further life and creating further fertility. And granted, with the way we live nowadays as humans, we take over those lands and we want them to essentially remain inviolate with our goods built into them and not in danger of destruction. And so when we see Ausse and the storms that he creates, potentially we should look at them from the eyes of the natural world, that he is helping to control and to establish the cycle of, even looking at it in terms of the cycle of water to vapor to cloud to rain and back again. That those simple cycles are kind of what Ausse is in charge of. But we could also see how that could easily be manipulated. And we could also see here, too, potentially another critique of industrialization, of the loss of the natural world, and see a critique of Tolkien's on the loss of nature in England, that this is causing, in some sense, a worsening or a erosion of the natural world because of our own actions, that we are losing that cyclical nature. And we can see then the work of Melkor as a way, again, getting back to that idea of order, of creating a world that's inviolate, that follows to the tune or to the beat of his drum. Well, if you have something that's completely ordered, nothing's out of line, nothing's moving out of turn, it's not alive. And in a way, it's dead. A couple of examples illustrate this fairly well. If you look at the auditors in Terry Pratchett's Discworld, they too, just like Melkor, want extreme order. They want everything to be orderly, everything to be predictable, everything to happen according to plan. And their method, what they're trying to do, is establish the complete destruction of everything, because then it'll be ordered. And that's what they attempt to do, and that's essentially what Melkor is doing. He may not be explicitly stated to be doing that, may not be his explicit goal, but essentially, if he follows the path he's after, that is what it will lead to. And that's kind of the critique we get too of Saruman, of the mechanization of the world. So when we look at this idea of order and control, we also see, in a sense, in the dwarves, to get back to that, a cautionary tale. Because if we pay attention to the dwarves prior to their adoption by Iluvatar, they're marionettes. They're nothing. They're essentially automatons that bend to the will of Aule. And when Aule comes to fully understand this, and understand his own transgression, he's horrified. And to a certain sense, when we look upon the dwarves prior to their adoption, I know I personally am kind of horrified by the idea of this half-life. That if Aule loses his train of thought and loses his focus, all of a sudden, Doran over there becomes a lump of rock, not alive, not doing anything. It's no longer life. And so obviously this is going to be something that, again, we're going to come back to over and over again, is to try to understand how all of these pieces fit in to the music and to our understanding of the cosmology that Tolkien is creating. Where do each of these elements fit? Where do they each fit in relation to each other? Because we talked with regards to the Lord of the Rings quite a bit about where the animosity between elves and dwarves come from. Well, the first and most obvious is the difference between being an actual child of Iluvatar and an adopted child of Iluvatar. And then secondary to that is the idea that potentially dwarves, because they were adopted and because they were created potentially outside of the music as a sort of revolt even, or transgression, and may not have been from the music from the beginning, and rather an insertion of Iluvatar at a later point, that they potentially can act outside of the music. And indeed, when we read the Silmarillion, dwarves actually play a pivotal role and seem to pop up in places where they are the linchpin in the story. Granted, they are usually very small roles, but they affect great change. And you can also question, too, how all of this fits in. Because when we think about the dwarves and creation, the creation of the dwarves, the story, the tale of Aule Nirvana is a late addition to the Silmarillion, after The Lord of the Rings has been written. And when we look back at The Hobbit, Thorin and company were essentially noted on multiple occasions as being the exception to the rule, and that other than being fairly honorable and sticking by their word, dwarves aren't pleasant people. And for much of the writing of the Silmarillion and the early tales, dwarves were on the side of evil. And so it calls into question exactly where do they fit into the nature of creation. And this sort of question of where peoples fit within creation, how there's a almost inbuilt relation to the events of the world and to the history of the world, is something we're going to return to over and over again. Now, when we continue with the Maiar, we move on to the Maiar under Morgoth, which are mainly the Balrogs. Now, what's interesting here is the name that is given to them is the Valaraukar, which is built off of two root words. Vala meaning power, and Aukar, I think it's Aukar or Raukar, meaning, where did I put that? Monster. And you could look at this potentially and wonder, is this meant to be a note of corruption? Valar turned into monster? Or is it even a reference to an idea about the Valraukar, the Balrogs, being the enemy or the monster against the Valar? There's no real answer on that. We know they are Maiar and therefore in some way lesser than Valar. But it does also reinforce the idea that we've discussed on occasion of the nature of fall. That in Tolkien, largely, everything falls. It doesn't start out evil, but rather falls from good. And therefore, the Balrogs truly are a corrupted, a monstrous power. We talked briefly, too, about Sauron, one of the greater Maiar, who was once under Aule. And we talked about his names, how he was once known as Mairon, and then Sauron and Gorthaur and Anatar. And in particular, how he is noted here as only being less evil than Morgoth because for a long period of time he served under another and followed the will of another. But what we see throughout the course of history is that each of them, Morgoth, Sauron, Saruman, essentially follow a similar trajectory towards trying to create order with a capital O, an order of dominance, an order that ultimately leads to lifelessness. And we looked in particular at the difference between the use of order as given by Saruman in Orthanc and Gandalf as used in relation to the White Order. And again, we return to a form of a biblical meta-narrative, because the order of Saruman, the order of Sauron, the order of Morgoth is top-down. It is my way. It is dominance and control. Whereas the order of Gandalf, the natural order of things, is fear. In the biblical sense, fear of the Lord does not mean being afraid, but rather having the fullness of respect deserved by that entity. And therefore following through, respecting and listening to and interacting with someone on the level at which they deserve. It's similar to the definition of humility. Humility isn't necessarily to constantly downplay or deprecate yourself, but rather to understand in the deepest part of your being exactly what you are capable of doing and doing it. Not inflating what you can do, but also not decreasing or deprecating what you can do, but actually being true to what you can do and true to who you are. And in a sense, we can look then again at this question of why are the hobbits so pivotal? Because they embody that definition of order and of humility just given, in the sense that Gandalf would understand it, of following through to the core of their being with their own capability, and of giving the respect, the honor, and the place due to those around them. And that includes not only true respect in the case of Frodo towards Gandalf, say, but also the sense, too, of the fear in the sense of being afraid or being threatened of danger and understanding the trueness of danger, but also looking deeper to understand the underpinnings in it. So then when we look at The Lord of the Rings, we can begin to understand that although it's not obvious, other than in the person of Gandalf, that Nienna underpins the entirety of the tale and lies at the foundation, particularly of the Hobbit action throughout all of the end of the Third Age. I invite you to join us next time. We will be discussing the beginning of the Quenta Silmarillion, the first chapter. We're actually going to be in the main body of the work, chapter 1, the beginning of days. Again, to find out more about us and to find out the schedule of when we'll next be meeting, look for us on Facebook at Greyhaven's Reading Group, and you can also look us up at greyhavensgroup.org.